with Senator Schumer and others, just to ensure that the American people, and certainly all of us, have the opportunity to ask the kind of questions that people would like to ask. I would say to members, I know some of us have an art form of being able to ask about 9 questions in time ending about 5 seconds before the respondent responds. The 10 minutes includes the response, and I'm going to be, in order to be respectful of everybody's time, which is a little bit unusual here, we're going to hold to that in a very rigid way. Our plan is that we will go until about 1 o'clock today, if everybody uses their time. We will take a break out of showing mercy to our nominee for about 45 minutes and to many of us up here. And then we'll come back and resume until such a time as we have the vote-a-rama, which I think begins around 6 o'clock this evening. Again, in order to make sure that all questions are answered, the ranking member and I have agreed that should there be another day necessary, we'll begin in the morning at 10 o'clock. Hopefully, with all that will happen today, that will be unnecessary, but our nominee is very aware that that may well occur. I think all of you know that our business meeting, again, in order to show respect for all who are here, is moved until tonight when we have the vote-a-rama, at which time we'll take up the accession, Montenegro accession to NATO, and we will take up the resolution relative to Israel. We'll do that off the floor this evening. So with that,
Mr. Chairman, can I just thank you for the accommodations for this hearing. I know you started it at 9 o'clock as an accommodation so that we could all have a little bit more time in the morning for asking questions, and I thank you very much for that, accommodating a 10-minute round. The two of us, the chairman and I, have worked closely together to make sure that this hearing was the type of hearing that we'd be proud of in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I want to personally thank you for that and welcome our 4 new members to our committee. And with that, I'll withhold until after the introductions.
This committee has been and certainly a beacon of bipartisanship, as was mentioned, sometimes an island of bipartisanship. But I think all of us understand the importance of us being united, especially when we leave the shore's edge. And I know that we will continue, we'll conduct the hearing today in that manner. With that, we have 4 very distinguished individuals who would like to introduce the nominee. We thank each of them for being here. I know that they plan to spend about 2.5 minutes each to do so. We welcome you here. We have the distinguished Senator Cornyn from Texas, the distinguished Senator Cruz from Texas, the distinguished Sam Nunn from Georgia, who we miss, but thank him for his service, and the distinguished Secretary Gates, who has served 8 presidents. I'm actually surprised he's not serving a 9th, but we thank you for being here. Each of you, if you would, please give your comments, and then we will move to opening statements. Thank you for being here. Senator Cornyn.
Chairman Corker and Ranking Member Cardin, members of the committee, I'm proud to be here today with my colleague Senator Cruz to introduce a fellow Texan, Rex Tillerson, as the nominee to be the next Secretary of State. Without a doubt, Rex Tillerson is an inspired choice by President-elect Trump for this critical position. The depth and breadth of his experience as an accomplished and successful business leader and skilled negotiator give him a solid understanding of our current geopolitical and economic challenges, making him uniquely qualified to serve in this important office. After graduating from the University of Texas with a degree in engineering, Mr. Tillerson joined the Exxon Corporation, eventually moving up the ranks and into overseas assignments in Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. In 2006, he assumed command of ExxonMobil, a tenure during which he displayed exceptional acumen, helping Exxon weather complex geopolitical obstacles to make the company into one of the world's most profitable corporations. As a lifelong Texan, Rex has been recognized for something you don't ordinarily associate with being a powerful business leader and head of one of the largest corporations in the world. He's been recognized for his humility and his altruism. One of my constituents recently wrote a piece in the Dallas Morning News talking about serving on a jury with Mr. Tillerson recently. She noted that on that jury, his natural leadership, ability, and charisma helped them deliver justice in a delicate and difficult case of sexual assault. Following the trial, Mr. Tillerson then donated to the local nonprofit that helped support and counsel the victim after the trial. Mr. Tillerson understands how to separate friendships and business. He knows who he works for. My first encounter with Rex was when I was Attorney General. I don't know if he remembers this, but we were on opposite sides of a lawsuit. I was representing, in my capacity as Attorney General, the state of Texas, and we had the temerity to sue ExxonMobil. And let's say our first encounter was a little awkward, to say the least. But over the years, I've grown to admire and respect Rex, and he didn't let our differences get in the way of what we could agree on. Since then, I've seen him demonstrate an uncanny ability that will serve him and our country well as its chief diplomat, and that is an ability to deftly handle business matters while maintaining and building relationships, a further testament to his integrity and strength of character. Once he's confirmed, I'm confident that he will be instrumental in shaping American foreign policy as we face a broad array of diplomatic challenges that will define the security and success of our nation for generations. So thank you, Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, members of the committee, for letting me introduce Rex Tillerson.
For being maybe the first prompt senator I've witnessed here. Thank you so much.
Trying to
Senator
set the
Cruz.
standard.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Cardin, members of the committee, good morning. It is a privilege to join you this morning and have the opportunity to help introduce my fellow Texan and the Secretary of State designee, Rex Tillerson. As many of you know, Rex is a Texan born and raised in Wichita Falls, and he's a proud Texas Longhorn, which John and I might think is plenty enough alone to qualify him for Secretary of State. But I recognize y'all might set a higher bar than that. The good news is that is only the beginning of a long, substantive list of qualifications, achievements, and international relationships that Rex brings to the table. A list that I believe has prepared him to be a strong candidate to lead our State Department as we face the monumental task of restoring America's influence across the world. As all of us know, this is no easy task. We live in a dangerous year and a dangerous world. And after the last 8 years, we face a circumstance where many of our friends no longer trust us, and many of our enemies no longer fear us. Rex Tillerson is a serious man who understands the value of perseverance, and he knows what it takes to accomplish difficult tasks. From an early age, he worked to climb the ranks in Boy Scouts to become an Eagle Scout, and he started as a production engineer at Exxon in 1975, eventually climbing his way to the top as CEO of the Fortune 10 company. At Exxon, he led one of the world's most respected companies with over 75,000 employees and over $250 billion in revenue. Exxon, a proud Texas company, does business in 52 countries. And Rex has traveled the globe negotiating business deals with world leaders, effectively advocating for the interests of his company, shareholders, and employees. The numerous achievements that Rex has earned, they don't come without hard work, dedication, and passion for one's mission. This is the work ethic and spirit that America needs in its Secretary of State. That is the attitude that gives me confidence in the opportunity that Rex has to chart a different, better, and stronger course for our national security and diplomacy. We need a Secretary of State who understands that America is exceptional, who will establish policies upon that foundation of exceptionalism, and who will put America's interest first. Repeatedly, the current administration has used the United Nations to try to circumvent the will of Congress and the American people. I look forward to a President and Secretary of State who will instead vigorously defend U.S. sovereignty. I believe that Rex has an incredible opportunity to defend the foreign policy principles upon which President-elect Trump campaigned, to strengthen our friendship and alliances, and to defeat our enemies. And I look forward to all of us working with him in the years ahead as we restore American leadership across the globe. Thank you.
Thank you also for those concise comments. Much appreciated. Thank you both for being here. And if should you need to leave to go to other hearings, please feel free to do so. Senator Nunn, sir. You need to turn your mic on, sir. You get out of practice leaving here for a few years.
I thank you, Chairman Corker and Senator Cardin, and my friend for a long time, Johnny Isakson, Senator Isakson, members of the committee. I just wish I'd thought of this clock a long time ago. It would have saved an awful lot of agony for our committee. So I'm going to try to cut my statement as short as possible and ask the whole statement be put into the record.
Without objection, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Rex Tillerson's resume is well known, so let me just tackle 2 points that I know have been raised with the committee as well as with the Senate. First, Rex Tillerson's knowledge of and experience in Russia. And second, how his work in the private sector prepares him to be our top diplomat and run one of the most important departments in our government. With respect to Russia, certain facts are clear. Russia's recent flagrant actions indicate that its national interests sharply differ from America's national interests in important places, most acutely in Ukraine, in Europe, and in Syria. Russia's values differ from America's values, and particularly in our form of government, our commitment to personal freedom, human rights, and the rule of law. These fundamental differences are very important, and the fact that our interests and values differ should always inform our policy toward Russia. But, Mr. Chairman, the important facts don't end here. It is also a fact that Russia today deploys hundreds of nuclear warheads on ballistic missiles that could be fired and hit their targets around the globe in less time than it will take to have opening statements at the hearing today. It is also a fact that for both the United States and Russia, the risk of an accidental, unauthorized, or mistaken launch of a nuclear ballistic missile is unnecessarily high, particularly in our world of increasing cyber vulnerability. It is also a fact that the United States and Russia, like it or not, are bound together in areas of unavoidable common interest, including the prevention of nuclear and biological terrorism, the prevention of nuclear proliferation, false warnings of nuclear attacks, and the hacking of command and control systems or nuclear facilities. These facts lead me to an inescapable conclusion. It is dangerous for the United States and Russia and for the world to have virtually no dialogue on reducing nuclear risk and very little military-to-military communication. If this continues, then we are guided by zero-sum logic. On both sides, we and Russia may be rewarded at some point with catastrophe. This is my judgment even when we have stark disputes, including strong evidence from our intelligence community that Russia has interfered in U.S. elections, a finding that Congress must fully examine, including its ominous implications for our political process and our security. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, there have been other moments in history when voices in both Washington and Moscow argued that our areas of disagreement were so great that we should not work on issues even of common interest between our two countries. For those who are considering this point, I would suggest rereading President Kennedy's commencement address at American University delivered just months after the Cuban Missile Crisis. President Kennedy spoke of the pursuit of peace as necessary and rational, quoting him, "In an age where a single nuclear weapon contains almost 10 times the explosive power delivered by all the Allied forces in the Second World War." President Kennedy rejected voices saying it is useless to speak of peace until the leaders of the Soviet Union adopt a more enlightened attitude. Kennedy warned, let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interest and to the means by which these differences can be resolved. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, these words remain true today. I know Rex Tillerson pretty well, and I am confident that he is well prepared to do what is essential for the security of our nation, to hold firm and tough where our national interests and values demand it, and to build on our common interest in working with other nations, including Russia, on practical, concrete steps that will make the American people safer and more secure. Mr. Chairman, Senator Cardin, and other members of the committee, I also consider Rex Tillerson's experience and knowledge in business as an asset, and as well as his knowledge of Russia. I think both are assets, not liability. I also consider his business experience very relevant to the world today. It's an asset. As I look at the world today, every significant international challenge we face has a very important business component. It's true in Ukraine, it's true in the Middle East, it's true in most places. Rex Tillerson knows these crucial regions, he knows the leaders, and he understands the challenges and the risk. He is also keenly aware of the power of the private sector and the important role it can play in addressing these fundamental issues. Mr. Chairman, in wrapping up, I'm confident that if confirmed to be Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson will take off his corporate hat, but he'll use his vast experience to devote 100% of his considerable intellect, energy, and experience to protecting America's interest in the troubled world we're in. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I urge his confirmation.
Thank you so much for being here and participating in your many, many contributions relative to nuclear safety around the world. Secretary Gates.
Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, distinguished members of the Foreign Relations Committee, it gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend and fellow Eagle Scout, Rex Tillerson, as the President-elect's nominee to be the next Secretary of State. I've known Mr. Tillerson for a number of years through our shared experience in leading the Boy Scouts of America. On many occasions, after a day of meetings, Rex and I would talk, often for hours, about international affairs, including Russia and Vladimir Putin. I believe I have a pretty good idea about how he thinks about the world and the challenges we face. The Secretary of State has 4 important roles: advising the President, negotiating with foreign governments and international organizations, representing the United States abroad, and leading the Department of State. Against a backdrop of having known or worked with 12 Secretaries of State, I believe Mr. Tillerson is superbly qualified to carry out each of these roles. He is deeply knowledgeable about the international scene and geopolitics, and importantly would be an informed and independent advisor to the President. He would be candid and honest, willing to tell the President straight from the shoulder what he needs to hear. He would bring decades of experience as a tough and successful negotiator with foreign governments to the position. I've heard him speak often to scout groups about American values, and I know he would be an eloquent and passionate representative of the United States to the world. And finally, based on his long experience in leading a major corporation as well as the Boy Scouts, I know he will lead the Department of State with skill and respect for the professionals. Much has been said and written about Mr. Tillerson and Russia. I've spent my entire adult life dealing with the Soviet Union and Russia. I joined CIA over 50 years ago to do my bit in the epic struggle with the Soviet Union. During that time, I acquired a reputation of something as a hardliner. Just ask a couple of previous Secretaries of State. Yet I knew that we not only had to resist and contain the USSR, we also had to contain the risk of conflict with it. And that meant engaging in dialogue, negotiations, and even reaching agreements limiting strategic nuclear weapons and establishing agreed procedures to prevent confrontations from escalating. This new administration must thread the needle between pushing back against Vladimir Putin's aggressions, meddling, interventionism, ambitions, and bullying, and at the same time find a way to stop a dangerous downward spiral in our relationship with Russia. I believe Mr. Tillerson is the right person at the right time to help accomplish both of those goals. And so it is with pride and confidence that I introduce him to you today and encourage his confirmation.
We thank you all for being here. You honor us with your presence. We thank you for your contribution. You do not have to leave, but you cannot stay there. So we actually hope you will stay somewhere in the premise and participate if you would like.
go home, but you can't stay here, is that right?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Good to have you here.
Thank you, Gavin.
Thanks, Ted.
Thank you. We have some new members to the committee today, and I was thinking prior to this hearing that 10 years ago, I came on this committee as a new senator. Many ways to broaden my ability to serve our nation and to serve our state, having been mostly a business person. When I came here, the first order of business was to deal with the surge in Iraq. Pretty monumental time. We had an under-resourced effort that was taking place in Iraq, and at a time when really in many ways the United States had unleashed forces in the region that had not been seen, not unlike taking in some ways a big stick and hitting a hornet's nest and changing dramatically the dynamic in the region. And so we had the choice of whether we surge and try to be successful at what we began or take another course. Afghanistan also had been under-resourced, and all of a sudden we began discussing things like nation building, things that had not been part of our vocabulary for many years. We had the Arab Spring that took place in 2011, again, some of which was built off of some of the activities that I mentioned earlier. And we had all kinds of incoherent things that took place. The quick throwing aside of a leader in Egypt that we had known for years, an undertaking in Libya that I still have never understood what the goal was, but left a large vacuum in the region with arms spreading throughout northern Africa and other places. We had the conflict in Syria that began, if you remember, with us cheering on the people who wanted basic human rights and more of a democracy. And then we had the red line that our country did not follow up on. After that, we had the taking of Crimea and the destabilizing of eastern Ukraine, some of which I think was driven by observing U.S. leadership in the world. We had China redrawing a map that had been around for thousands of years in the South China Sea and claiming islands and properties and building runways and doing things that, again, until that time had not occurred. We've had the whole destabilization of Europe, where I think confidence levels in Europe are probably the lowest they've been in our lifetimes, driven by concerns about, in many cases, what our role is, but also the role of Russia and what it's been doing in the region, the role of immigrants that are flowing in, the whole challenging of the European model. And then we've had a campaign, let's face it, that has been somewhat unorthodox, one that has also given concern to our allies in the world and to many around the world as to just where America is going to be. With all of this chaos that has exhibited through multiple administrations and will continue under this for a period of time, we've had chaos where the United States has been withdrawing in its leadership role. And to me, that's a recipe for further chaos. So this is a very important hearing. I had the ability the other day to sit down with General Flynn, who's going to be the National Security Advisor, and has spent time with people around him for some time. And I know that, rightly so, his focus is also on our country doing well economically. Every military leader we've had before us, and certainly Secretary Gates, have told us that if our nation is not strong economically, if we're not doing the things fiscally to keep ourselves strong, then our nation will be weak and our leadership around the world will be diminished. And so I'm thankful that that is the case. A lot of people here realize that it's not only important for us to be economically successful, But we understand that autocrats in other places, when they themselves are not successful, end up creating havoc around the world for nationalistic reasons to build support within their countries. And therefore, we don't wish the other major countries in the world harm as it relates to economic growth. We want them to do well, countries like China and even Russia, who no doubt has conducted very nefarious activities here in our country. Many of us have seen in the Middle East the fact that poverty, not unlike what happens in our own country, where people who live in cities and neighborhoods have no hope, crime permeates, things occur. And we've seen the same thing happen in the Middle East, where young people with no hope are attracted to ideologies that end up threatening our own nation. So I appreciate the fact that at the National Security Office, they're not only connected to those who will be dealing with our issues of foreign policy and our role in the world, but also focus on those economic issues, which brings me to trade. Our country has shown great leadership around the world. Rob Portman served as our trade representative in previous administrations, and there's been a great deal of talk about what our role will be in that regard. I think most of us believe that a world that continues to focus on free enterprise, a world that continues to have democratic principles more and more permeated, is a world that's a better place for us. And while we should also always focus on trade as it relates to improving the standard of living of Americans, an ancillary benefit is that people within those countries begin to adopt the values that we hold so dear here in our country. One of the things that many of us on the committee and so many in the audience have been able to do is also to see the importance of American values around the world. It's an amazing thing to be in Afghanistan, for instance, and to see women at 4:30 in the morning, who, by the way, do all of the hard work in Afghanistan, up and ready to vote in the first election that they've voted in, or to see young girls going to schools that they never had the opportunity to go to be in refugee camps where truly every eye is on the American that's there with hope, to be in Venezuela and to see families whose loved ones are in prison for political reasons and looking to us to change that, to be in villages in Africa where for the first time, because of American ingenuity, 600 million people without power now have hope with very little in the way of U.S. resources, but our leadership in setting a vision and working with others. The elimination almost of HIV, the dealing with malaria, the dealing with other diseases like Ebola. Many of us, all of us, I think, have been in situations where young people just want to touch us. They just want to see us. They want to hug Americans because they, like the people who founded our country, believe in the American ideal. It's not just a country, but it's their hope. It's their vision of what their life might be with American leadership. I believe the world's at its best when America leads, and I think most people at this dais believe the same thing. And we understand the importance of diplomacy, and that all of us know with the 1% of the U.S. budget that we spend on efforts like Mr. Tillerson may lead, with that 1%, if we're successful, the likelihood of the men and women that we cherish so much in our military are much less likely to be in harm's way. Which brings me to you. This is a person, Mr. Tillerson, who, by the way, had never met Mr. Trump, as I understand, until a few weeks ago, a month ago. I believe, like Senator Cornyn said, that it's very, very possible that you are, in fact, an inspired choice. We look at the president who, if you think about it, approaches everything almost from an economic standpoint. That's been the world that he has lived in. And the fact that you've led a global enterprise with 70,000 employees around the world, have been there for 41.5 years, have met world leaders, know them up close and personally. To me, that is going to give our new president much greater confidence in your ability to offer advice. And I think it's going to give the State Department possibly the ability to have the appropriate balance with other forces as it relates within the White House and other places, as it relates to developing a vision for our country. If you think about it, not only does the world not really understand where America is today, and all of us have had leaders in our offices wondering what is next, all of us. But if you think about the body politic here in our own country, doesn't understand. You look at the election, we had the Bush presidency, and then we had the Obama presidency, which was not the Bush presidency, and then we've had this election where many things have been said, and sometimes in unorthodox ways. And so not just the world leaders not know where we are, not just citizens who watch us on television and other places, but our body politic here does not know. So, Mr. Tillerson, this is a momentous time. This, to me, is the most important nomination that the President has made. The world paying attention to this hearing, I think, denotes that. You have the ability, no doubt, to draw a crowd. But it's going to be your responsibility to define clearly what America's role in the world is going to be. I know Secretary Gates has spoken to this many times as he talks about the way the world was when it was us and the Soviet Union. But now it's very different. And the American people even don't fully understand what the future holds. You've got to restore our credibility, secondly. Look, the NATO alliance is shaken. Europe is shaken. Our Arab friends, because of negotiations that have taken place, are concerned about the future. And I could go on, but I want to be respectful to other people's time. But one of your first goals is going to be to restore U.S. credibility around the world. You're going to need to prioritize. One of the things I've witnessed over the last for the entire 10 years I've been here, actually, is there's a lot of activity that takes place, but it's hard to discern where it's taking us. And so I think as a person who's led an organization, who's risen from the bottom, who's been the CEO of a global enterprise, may in fact be an inspired choice to prioritize, to restore credibility, which is what a company like yours has had to do, to have those relationships based on trust, based on people knowing that we're going to do what we say. And then lastly, you are the person that is charged with being the principal advisor to the President on foreign policy. And I think that's the question that people on both sides of the aisle will raise most here today is, we know that the President-elect's foreign policy is evolving as he takes office, as he talks to people, and there's no way that you could speak on his behalf today. That cannot happen. So what people here today are going to want to know is, how are you going to advise him? You're going to be one of the last people to talk to him. You're going to be up under the hood, sharing with him what you think ought to happen. We know that at the end of the day, you're going to carry out his policy, and all of us have watched as other secretaries of state have tried to carry out their own policy and not the President's, and we know that that does not work. So we thank you for being here. My sense is that you are going to rise to the occasion, that you are going to demonstrate that you are, in fact, an inspired choice, that you're going to be able to take the years of accomplishment and relationships and transfer that and translate it into a foreign policy that benefits U.S. national interest thank you again for being willing to put yourself before our country and the world in this manner. And with that, let me turn to our distinguished ranking member and my friend, Ben Cardin.
Well, again, Senator Corker, thank you very much for the accommodations in this hearing. And I agree with your final comment. This hearing is about Mr. Tillerson and Mr. Tillerson's views. But I think we're going to have some specific questions because of statements made by Mr. Trump. But we do want to hear your views, particularly as it relates to many of the challenges that Chairman Corker went through in his opening statement. To Senator Nunn, it's a pleasure to have you in our committee, and we thank you very much for your years of public service. Secretary Gates, thank you for all of your service, and you honor our committee, both of you, by being here today. And I also want to once again welcome our new colleagues, Senator Booker, Senator Merkley, Senator Portman, Senator Young. I've worked with all four of you before in different capacities, and I know your commitment to our national security and to foreign policy, and I know you all will be great additions to our committee. I want to acknowledge Senator King, who is here. It's not the first time that Senator King has been in our committee room to observe a hearing. We got to get you on the committee, but we thank you again for your interest in this hearing. And Mr. Tillerson, as I told you in our private meeting, thank you. Thank you for being willing to serve the public. It's not easy to put yourself forward. As you found since your nomination has been brought forward, your life has changed pretty dramatically, not just for you, but for your entire family. And we thank you for your willingness to serve our country. Providing advice and consent on the nominees of the President is one of the most important constitutional powers of the Senate. It's an awesome responsibility, and one that I know that all of us on this committee take with the utmost seriousness. Mr. Tillerson, there is no question about your impressive record in the business world, rising through the ranks and then running Exxon, one of the largest multinational operations in the world. Yet, I would offer, having a view from the C-suite at Exxon is not at all the same as a view from the 7th floor of the Department of State. And those who suggest that anyone who can run a successful business can, of course, run a government agency do a profound disservice to both. Serving the narrow, market-driven interest of Exxon shareholders is not the same as serving the national interest of all the American people. Effective corporate governance and management does not always lend itself to government decision-making, where bureaucracies and representative institutions such as Congress serve a different political and social purposes than maximizing profits. I therefore want to get a sense of how you envision pivoting from the mindset of an oil man focused on profits to that of a statesman focused on promoting American interest and values around the world. And as you know, Congress, as a separate and co-equal branch of government, has an important role to play in assuring that the values that have animated our nation since its founding continue to flourish. So first, I want to share with you, as I did in our private meeting, my vision of the United States foreign policy and the role of the Secretary of State in carrying out that policy. I approach this hearing and discussion today with a clear set of expectations of the next administration. I believe strongly in a world where America works with its allies and partners, a world that is governed by laws and institutions consistent with the liberal international order, and one where we champion our values both at home and abroad. Indeed, I think it's worth spending a few minutes this morning on the questions of human rights, democracy, good governance, anti-corruption, and civil society support. It is worth doing so both because of the critical importance of these issues for America's role in the world, and our values are our interests, not a separate set of considerations, but also because of the nature of Exxon and your work there. Mr. Tillerson leaves some troubling questions about how you view these issues and how you, as Secretary of State, intend to approach them. As you may know, over the course of my tenure in the House and Senate, I've championed the cause of human rights and the importance of democratic process and good governance. So when I see violations of the sovereignty by China in the South China Sea, I speak out. When I see gross human rights violations in Ethiopia, I speak out. When I see massive corruptions in countries with extreme poverty, like Equatorial Guinea, I speak out. And when I see severe erosion of democratic institutions in Venezuela, I speak out. Indeed, events over the past year serve as a stark reminder that democracy will not defend itself. It requires those of us who believe in the enduring values of the democratic experiment to nurture and support it, and to defend it from authoritarian opponents who do not share our values. Perhaps the most egregious events we've seen recently has been what has happened by President Putin of Russia, having effectively killed the nation's nuanced democracy, has led efforts across Europe and the former Soviet Union to erode support for democratic institutions and calls into question well-established rules of the road. Moscow directs efforts to undermine democracy through propaganda, false news, cyber attacks, and funding for populist political parties abroad. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that these nefarious activities have reached our shores, but it's stunning nonetheless. Last week, the intelligence community found that Mr. Putin did indeed direct efforts to interfere in our elections. That's their conclusion. They found that the Kremlin attacked Hillary Clinton and directed resources to that end. I'm not saying that Russia's efforts were decisive in our election outcome. That's not the point. The point is that we, the United States, were victims of cyber attack of our democratic process. Recent news accounts indicate Russia may well have information about Mr. Trump, and they could use that to compromise our presidency. It cannot be business as usual. That is why I was proud to introduce a bipartisan bill yesterday with Senator McCain and several members of this committee, including Senator Menendez, Shaheen, Rubio, and Portman, along with Senator Graham, Klobuchar, Sass, and Durbin, which will impose enhanced sanctions on Russia for its interference in our election and its ongoing aggression in Ukraine and Syria. We need to stand up to this bully in Moscow and increase the cost for his behavior. So I was disappointed that in your prepared opening remarks submitted to the committee yesterday, there was no mention about the direct confirmed cyber attack by Russia on America. But you did find time to say it was the absence of American leadership that this door was left open and unintended signals were sent. So I want to know exactly what additional actions the United States should have taken against Russia, in your view. Do you, for example, support additional sanctions against Russia, demonstrating America's leadership like what my colleagues and I introduced yesterday? Mr. Tillerson, I'm sure you can understand why I and many of my colleagues have deep concerns about your relationship with Mr. Putin. And this is not simply a question of what you saw when you gazed into his eyes. You don't strike me as someone likely to be naive, but also about how Exxon conducted itself in supporting directly and indirectly funding for the tools that Putin has used to crush democracy and dissent at home and to sow division abroad. While I do not suggest it was your intent, it's frankly not too great of a distance from Exxon's business partnerships to Putin's Kremlin-controlled slush funds essential for his disinformation campaign around the world. You will be representing a president who may blatantly ignore the consensus of 17 independent intelligence agencies who have said that the Russian interfered with our election in an unprecedented way. The same president to whom you will report has also made it clear that he may ignore Putin's invasion of Ukraine, his illegal annexation of Crimea, his interference in Syria, where Russian forces partnered with Iran, Hezbollah, and Shia militia to shift battlefield momentum towards a dictator guilty of war crimes. Russia itself is culpable of war crimes for its backing of Bashar al-Assad, who has starved, barrel-bombed, and tortured the Syrian people into submission. And yet, President-elect Trump may take quick steps to make Putin a close ally of the United States of America. So there's serious discussion to be had here today about Russia and the President-elect's plans for Putin, and we need to know and understand your views, as the chairman has said, on these critical issues of national security. In addition, if we take seriously that your tenure and experience at Exxon serves as qualifications for Secretary of State, then there's likewise a serious discussion this committee needs to have about the potential for conflicts of interest that arise from your long corporate tenure. For far too long, in my estimation, U.S. foreign policy has treated core governance issues as secondary considerations. If you become our nation's top diplomat, I want to know if governance issues will become a primary consideration. I've always worked to treat government issues as one of the most important aspects of our foreign policy. I have been centrally involved in several legislative efforts over the years to bring transparency to extractive industries, to foster high standards on corrupt practices, and to use all the tools at our disposal when it comes to supporting human rights and civil societies. So I'm troubled that on many of these issues, Exxon, under your leadership, appears to have been pushing in the opposite direction. Mr. Tillerson, we have much to discuss. If confirmed, you will be assuming your new job at a consequential time. Indeed, I believe the United States today stands as a turning point in history. National power, economic, military, diplomatic, is being redefined and redistributed across the globe. International institutions, international financial and economic orders are under distress. Climate change is causing irreparable harm and creating and leading to greater instability. In many parts of the world, there's a view that American power, determination, and maybe more importantly, our support for American values is uncertain. And clearly, candidate Trump added to that uncertainty. We have global challenges. The Middle East is undergoing a period of unprecedented violence and instability. Iran is committed to confrontations with the United States and its allies, fomenting terrorism to challenge regional order. There are no less than 3 civil wars in this part of the world. U.S. leadership is required to not only support movement towards negotiated political settlements. 6 years after the hope of Arab Spring, the region has entered into a long winter in which many governments are backsliding in inclusive politics space for civil society and open economies. The fractured Middle East underscores my fundamental belief that the United States cannot pursue a hard-nosed security agenda or economic ties without prioritizing values such as political inclusion, human rights, and free, active media and civil society. Without these elements, instability will persist, with serious implications for countering violent extremism and stemming the flow of refugees heading for Europe's shore. I also need to stress that our important partner in this part of the world, Israel, needs more than tweets about how great our relationship is going to be. I hope we will hear from you today concrete visions with specific proposals for the way to forward in strengthening that strategic partnership. And despite the challenges, encouraging opportunities exist for our country. President Obama leaves the next administration as an inheritance: strengthened relationships with historic allies in Europe and Asia, a re-energized partnership with India, and growing economic relations with countries across sub-Saharan Africa that provide promising platforms to advance U.S. security and economic interests. I recognize that what I outlined here may not be in line with President-elect Trump's vision of the world, but I believe that core values like standing up against violations of international law, against war crimes, against human rights violations, against corruption, and speaking up for democracy and freedom of speech must be at the forefront of Americans' foreign policy agenda. Finally, I want to note that if confirmed, you will be taking over as leader of one of the most skilled and able workforces of any organization on the planet. Our foreign affairs and development professionals are truly among the most able and dedicated of our public servants on the front lines safeguarding our national security. And as ranking member of this committee, I have benefited greatly from their insight and counsel over the years. I hope and trust and encourage you will take full advantage of the dedicated public servants of the Department of State and USAID should you be confirmed. They are deeply committed to protecting and extending our nation's values and interests. I am certain that you and our nation will benefit greatly from a full and robust partnership between your office and the department you have been nominated to lead. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to hearing from our witness, and I look forward to questionings.
Mr. Tillerson, thank you for being here. I think you've been adequately introduced, and I think the world knows more about you than they ever thought today. So without using any more time, we thank you for being here today. I know you may have some family members to introduce, which is always helpful. And if you wish to do so, begin with that and then with your comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, I do have members of my family with me today. My wife, Renda, for more than 30 years, who has kept a welcoming home when I would come back from my many travels, and also for our sons and our 5 grandchildren. My sister, Jolynn Peters, a lifelong educator, high school mathematics teacher, math teacher coach, teaching many, many years in the Texas public school systems. My sister, Dr. Rayanne Hamilton, family practice physician in Abilene, Texas for more than 30 years. And my brother-in-law, Judge Lee Hamilton, is now finishing or has just begun to serve his 5th term on the bench at the 104th District of the State District Courts of Texas in Abilene, Texas. I appreciate so much the love and support they've given me in my past endeavors, but most particularly that they would come all the way up from Texas to be with me today. Good morning, Chairman Corker and others. I'm honored to have the backing of Senator Cornyn, Senator Cruz from my home state of Texas. I do want to thank Senator Nunn for his commitment to nuclear nonproliferation, something that he remains as steadfast today as ever, and to Secretary Gates for his service to 8 U.S. presidents and his own leadership as President of the Boy Scouts of America. Chairman Corker, Ranking Member Cardin, and members of the committee, it is an honor to appear before you today as President-elect Trump's nominee for Secretary of State and seek the approval of this committee and the full Senate for my confirmation. I come before you at a pivotal time in both the history of our nation and our world. Nearly everywhere we look, people and nations are deeply unsettled. Old ideas and international norms which were well understood and governed behaviors in the past may no longer be effective in our time. We face considerable threats in this evolving new environment. China has emerged as an economic power in global trade, and our interactions have been both friendly and adversarial. While Russia seeks respect and relevance on the global stage, its recent activities have disregarded America's interest. Radical Islam is not a new ideology, but it is hateful, deadly, and an illegitimate expression of the Islamic faith. Adversaries like Iran and North Korea pose grave threats to the world because of their refusal to conform to international norms. As we confront these realities, how should America respond? My answer is simple. To achieve the stability that is foundational to peace and security in the 21st century, American leadership must not only be renewed, it must be asserted. We have many advantages on which to build. Our alliances are durable, and our allies are looking for a return of our leadership. Our men and women in uniform are the world's finest fighting force, and we possess
My home was destroyed. Senators, be brave. Protect my community. Protect America. Rex Tillerson, I reject you. I reject you. My home was destroyed by Hurricane Sandy.
Our men and women in uniform are the world's finest fighting force, and we possess the world's largest economy. America is still the destination of choice for people the world over because of our track record of benevolence and hope for our fellow man. America has been indispensable in providing the stability to prevent another world war, increase global prosperity, and encourage the expansion of liberty. Our role in the world has also historically entailed a place of moral leadership. In the scope of international affairs, America's level of goodwill toward the world is unique, and we must continue to display a commitment to personal liberty, human dignity, and principled action in our foreign policy. Quite simply, we are the only global superpower with the means and the moral compass capable of shaping the world for good. If we do not lead, we risk plunging the world deeper into confusion and danger. But we have stumbled. In recent decades, we have cast American leadership into doubt. In some instances, we have withdrawn from the world. In others, we have intervened with good intentions, but did not achieve the stability and global security we sought. Instead, our actions and our non-actions have triggered a host of unintended consequences and created a void of uncertainty. Today, our friends still want to help us, but they don't know how. And meanwhile, our adversaries have been emboldened to take advantage of this absence of American leadership. In this campaign, President-elect Trump proposed a bold new commitment to advancing American interest in our foreign policy. I hope to explain what this approach means and how I would implement it if confirmed as Secretary of State. Americans welcome this rededication to American security, liberty, and prosperity. But new leadership is incomplete without accountability. If accountability does not start with ourselves, we cannot credibly extend it to our friends and our adversaries. We must hold ourselves accountable to upholding the promises we make to others. An America that can be trusted in good faith is essential to supporting our partners, achieving our goals, and assuring our security. We must hold our allies accountable to commitments they make. We cannot look the other way at allies who do not meet their obligations. This is an injustice not only to us, but to long-standing friends who honor their promises and bolster our own national security, such as Israel. And we must hold those who are not our friends accountable to the agreements they make. Our failure to do this over the recent decades has diminished our standing and encouraged bad actors around the world to break their word. We cannot afford to ignore violations of international accords, as we have done with Iran. We cannot continue to accept empty promises like the ones China has made to pressure North Korea to reform, only to shy away from enforcement. Looking the other way when trust is broken only encourages more bad behavior, and it must end. We cannot be accountable, though, if we are not truthful and honest in our dealings. As you are aware, my longstanding involvement with the Boy Scouts of America, one of our bedrock ideals is honesty. Indeed, the phrase, "on my honor," begins the Boy Scout oath, and it must undergird our foreign policy. In particular, we need to be honest about radical Islam. It is with good reason that our fellow citizens have a growing concern about radical Islam and the murderous acts committed in its name against Americans and our friends. Radical Islam poses a grave risk to the stability of nations and the well-being of their citizens. Powerful digital media platforms now allow ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and other terror groups to spread a poisonous ideology that runs completely counter to the values of the American people and all people around the world who value human life. These groups are often enabled and emboldened by nations, organizations, and individuals sympathetic to their cause. These actors must face consequences for aiding and abetting what can only be called evil. The most urgent step in thwarting radical Islam is defeating ISIS. The Middle East and its surrounding regions pose many challenges which require our attention, including Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. There are competing priorities in this region which must be and will be addressed, but they must not distract from our utmost mission of defeating ISIS. Because when everything is a priority, nothing is a priority. Defeating ISIS must be our foremost priority in the Middle East. Eliminating ISIS would be the first step in disrupting the capabilities of other groups and individuals committed to striking our homeland and our allies. The demise of ISIS will also allow us to increase our attention on other agents of radical Islam, like Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and certain elements within Iran. But defeat will not occur on the battlefield alone. We must win the war of ideas. If confirmed, I will ensure the State Department does its part in supporting Muslims around the world who reject radical Islam in all its forms. We should also acknowledge the realities about China. China's island building in the South China Sea is an illegal taking of disputed areas without regard for international norms. China's economic and trade practices have not always followed its commitments to global agreements. It steals our intellectual property and is aggressive and expansionist in the digital realm. It has not been a reliable partner in using its full influence to curb North Korea. China has proven a willingness to act with abandon in the pursuit of its own goals, which at times has put it in conflict with American interest. We have to deal with what we see, not what we hope. But we need to see the positive dimensions in our relationship with China as well. The economic well-being of our two nations is deeply intertwined. China has been a valuable ally in curtailing certain elements of radical Islam. We should not let disagreements over other issues exclude areas for productive partnership. We must also be clear-eyed about our relationship with Russia. Russia today poses a danger, but it is not unpredictable in advancing its own interest. It has invaded the Ukraine, including the taking of Crimea. and supported Syrian forces that brutally violates the laws of war. Our NATO allies are right to be alarmed at a resurgent Russia. But it was in the absence of American leadership that this door was left open and unintended signals were sent. We backtracked on commitments we made to allies. We sent weak or mixed signals with red lines that turned into green lights. We did not recognize that Russia does not think like we do. Words alone do not sweep away an uneven and at times contentious history between our two nations. But we need an open and frank dialogue with Russia regarding its ambitions so we know how to chart our own course. Where cooperation with Russia based on common interest is possible, such as reducing the global threat of terrorism, we ought to explore these options. Where important differences remain, we should be steadfast in defending the interest of America and her allies. Russia must know that we will be accountable to our commitments and those of our allies, and that Russia must be held to account for its actions. Our approach to human rights begins by acknowledging that American leadership requires moral clarity. We do not face an either-or choice on defending global human rights. Our values are our interest when it comes to human rights and humanitarian assistance. It is unreasonable to expect that every foreign policy endeavor will be driven by human rights considerations alone, especially when the security of the American people is at stake. But our leadership demands action specifically focused on improving the conditions of people the world over, utilizing both aid and, where appropriate, economic sanctions as instruments of foreign policy. And we must adhere to standards of accountability. Our recent engagements with the government of Cuba was not accompanied by any significant concessions on human rights. We have not held them accountable for their conduct. Their leaders received much, while their people received little. That serves neither the interest of Cubans or Americans. Abraham Lincoln declared that America is the last best hope of earth. Our moral light must not go out if we are to remain an agent of freedom for mankind. Supporting human rights in our foreign policy is a key component of clarifying to a watching world what America stands for. In closing, let us also be proud about the ideals that define us and the liberties we have secured at great cost. The ingenuity, ideas, and culture of Americans who came before us made the United States the greatest nation in history. So have their sacrifices. We should never forget that we stand on the shoulders of those who have sacrificed much, and in some cases, everything. They include our fallen heroes in uniform, our Foreign Service officers, and other Americans in the field who likewise gave all for their country. If confirmed in my work for the President and the American people, I will seek to engender trust with foreign leaders and governments and put in place agreements that will serve the purposes and interests of American foreign policy. The Secretary of State works for the President and seeks to implement his foreign policy objectives. To do that, I must work closely with my Cabinet colleagues and all relevant departments and agencies of the administration to build consensus. But let me also stress that keeping the President's trust means keeping the public trust. And keeping the public trust means keeping faith with their elected representatives. I want all the members of this committee to know that should I be confirmed, I will listen to your concerns and those of your staff and partner together to achieve great things for the country we all love. I'm an engineer by training. I seek to understand the facts, follow where they lead, and apply logic to all international affairs. We must see the world for what it is, have clear priorities, and understand that our power is considerable, but it is not infinite. We must, where possible, build pathways to new partnerships and strengthen old bonds which have frayed. If confirmed, I intend to conduct a foreign policy consistent with these ideals. We will never apologize for who we are or what we hold dear. We will see the world for what it is, be honest with ourselves and the American people, follow facts where they lead us, and hold ourselves and others accountable. I thank you for your time and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Do you commit to appear and testify upon request from this committee?
Yes, sir.
With that, I know the committee members know I rarely give opening statements, certainly not expansive ones like I gave. In order to move this along, I'm going to reserve my time for interjections and move to the ranking member, Senator Cardin, and then we'll move to Senator Rubio.
Once again, Mr. Tillerson, thank you very much. Do you agree with me that creating stable, democratic, free societies around the world that support the aspirations of their people, including basic human rights, is in our long-term national security interest?
Without question, Senator.
And do you also agree that Russia, under Mr. Putin's leadership, fails in that category?
Yes, sir.
So what we try to do in order to provide international leadership is to put a face on an issue. Thousands of people in Russia have been harmed or killed as a result of Mr. Putin's leadership, and millions have been impacted by that. There's one person who lost his life in a courageous way, Sergei Magnitsky, a young attorney representing a client with U.S. interests, found corruption, did what any lawyer is supposed to do, reported it to the authorities. As a result, he was arrested, tortured, and killed. And those who benefited from the corruption were held with no accountability whatsoever. Through U.S. leadership, we brought that case to the international forum. The Congress has passed a law, the Magnitsky Law. Other countries have now passed similar laws to deny our banking system and the right to visit our country to those who perpetrated those gross violations of human rights that were not held accountable by Russia. Do you support that law?
Yes, sir, I do.
I thank you for that, because under the Obama administration, there have been 39 individuals who have been individually sanctioned under the Magnitsky Law, and 5 more were just recently added on Monday. That law provides for Congress to be able to submit through appropriate channels additional names to be reviewed by the administration for inclusion for sanctions. Do you commit that you will follow that provision on names that we submit to you for potential sanctions for human rights violations under the Magnitsky Law?
Senator, I will ensure that if confirmed, myself and the State Department does comply with that law.
And this year, under the National Defense Authorization Act, that was extended globally. It now applies to human rights violations throughout the world. Do you also commit to support the global Magnitsky Law using the tools of our visa restrictions to prevent human rights violators from coming to America?
Senator, again, consistent with all applicable laws that might impact immigration, we'll endeavor to comply with that, yes.
Well, the laws allow the Secretary of State to visas are privileges to come to America. There's no due process issue on issuing of visas. This is a privilege to be able to come to a country. So we have, there's no, I'm not aware of any restrictions on your ability to withdraw the right of someone to come to America. There may be, other than through treaties that we have diplomats that have to come in, which is exempted from that provision.
I understand, Senator, and that was what I intended, is that I think I would ensure that a full examination was made of any and all applicable laws or other policies, but then we would follow those and implement.
You mentioned in your statement about the invasion by Russia of Crimea. Does Russia have in your view, a legal claim to Crimea?
No, sir. That was a taking of territory that was not theirs.
And do you agree that Russia has not complied with the Minsk agreement in regards to the resolution of Ukraine?
The process for implementing the Minsk agreement, as I understand it, it continues, and no a full completion of all the Minsk Accords has not yet been achieved.
So I want to get your view on the sanctions that the United States applied, and maybe I'll drill down, if I might, by asking you this first question. You stated in your statement that part of the reasons why Russia, or we were ineffective in preventing Russia, is that we didn't exercise strong enough international leadership. What would you have done or recommended to have been done to prevent Russia from doing what it did?
Well, Senator, in terms of the taking of Crimea, I think my understanding is that that caught a lot of people by surprise. It certainly caught me by surprise, just as a private citizen. So I think the real question was the response to the taking of Crimea that then led to subsequent actions by Russia, which I mentioned. The next action being coming across the border of eastern Ukraine with both military assets and men. That was the next illegal action. I think the absence of a very firm and forceful response to the taking of Crimea was judged by the leadership in Russia as a weak response, and therefore...
So what would you have done after we were surprised by what they did in taking over Crimea? What should the U.S. leadership have done in response to that we didn't do?
I would have recommended that the Ukraine take all of its military assets it had available, put them on that eastern border, provide those assets with defensive weapons that are necessary just to defend themselves, announce that the U.S. is going to provide them intelligence and that there will either NATO or U.S. will provide air surveillance over that border to monitor any movements.
So your recommendation would have been to do a more robust supply of military?
Yes, sir. I think what Russian leadership would have understood as a powerful response that indicated, yes, you took the Crimea, but this stops right here.
So as I understand, our NATO partners, particularly in the Baltics and Poland, are very concerned about Russian aggression. NATO has deployed troops in this region in order to show Russia that Article 5 means something. I take it you support that type of action.
Yes, I do. That is the type of response that Russia expects. If Russia acts with force, taking of Crimea was an act of force. They didn't just volunteer themselves. So that required a proportional show of force to indicate to Russia that there'll be no more taking of territory.
And that's encouraging to me to hear you say that, because it's not exactly consistent with what Mr. Trump has been saying in regards to Article 5 commitments under NATO by the United States. So I appreciate your commitment, or your views on that issue. So let me get to the response that was done. We imposed U.S.-led sanctions against Russia as a result of its conduct in Ukraine. We went to Europe and were able to get Europe to act. The United States, in my view, wanted to go even further, but we couldn't get Europe to go beyond what they were willing to do. Do you agree or disagree with that strategy for the United States to lead by showing sanctions as we did?
Senator, sanctions are a powerful tool, and they're an important tool in terms of deterring additional action. Once actors have acted up, then we want to deter any further action on their part. So yes, American leadership is oftentimes, if not almost always, required to demonstrate that first step.
And as you understand, unless we move, and we have to move in a strong position, we're going to be the best. We're going to get the strongest reaction on sanctions from the United States. We saw that in Iran. And I know that some of us have mentioned to you the legislation that was filed yesterday. I don't know if you've had a chance yet to respond to it or not. I might do that for questions for the record. But we have legislation I would urge you to take a look at that seems consistent with what you're saying here, that would provide the administration with the tools to show Russia that if you attack us by cyber, or you continue to do what you're doing in Ukraine or what you're doing in Georgia, that there's going to be an economic price you're going to pay. I take it you believe that's a powerful tool and one that you would consider applying.
Senator, I have not had the opportunity to review the legislation. I'm aware that it has been introduced. And yes, I think in carrying out the State Department, carrying out its diplomacy, or carrying out its important role in trying to negotiate to a different course of action, to a different pathway, we need a strong deterrent in our hand. It's the old tenet of Teddy Roosevelt, walk softly, carry a big stick. Well, even in diplomacy, it is useful to have a stick that is in your hand so that whether you use it or not becomes part of that conversation.
Let me ask one final question. I was meeting with Mr. Pruitt yesterday, and I asked him about his view of global leadership on climate issues, and he said that you should ask that question to the Secretary of State nominee. So I'm going to ask it to you. And that is, we were part of COP21. Do you agree that the United States should continue in international leadership on climate change issues with the international community?
I think it's important that the United States maintain its seat at the table on the conversations around how to address threats of climate change, which do require a global response. No one country is going to solve this alone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Rubio.
Welcome, Mr. Tillerson. Do you believe during the 2016 presidential campaign, Russian intelligence services directed a campaign of active measures involving the hacking of emails, the strategic leak of these emails, the use of internet trolls, and the dissemination of fake news with the goal of denigrating a presidential candidate and also undermining faith in our election process?
Senator, I've had no unclassified briefings because I've not received my clearance yet. However, I did read the interagency report that was released on January the 6th. That report clearly is troubling and indicates that all of the actions you just described were undertaken.
Based on your knowledge of Russian leaders and Russian politics, do you believe these activities could have happened without the knowledge and the consent of Vladimir Putin?
I'm not in a position to be able to make that determination. Again, that's indicated in the report, but I know there's additional classified information that might inform my
You've engaged in
view.
significant business activities in Russia, so I'm sure you're aware that very few things of a major proportion happen in that country without Vladimir Putin's permission. So I ask, based on your views of Russian politics and your experience, is it possible for something like this involving the United States elections to have happened without Vladimir Putin knowing about it and authorizing it?
I think that's a fair assumption.
That he would have
Yes.
needed to. If Congress passed a bill imposing mandatory visa bans and asset freeze sanctions on persons who engage in significant activities undermining the cybersecurity of public or private infrastructure and democratic institutions in the United States, would you advise the President to sign it?
I would certainly want to examine all the corners, all four corners of that.
Well, those are the four corners. We would sanction people who are involved in cyber attacks against the United States and interfering in our elections.
The threat of cyber attacks is a broad issue, and those are coming from many, many corners of the world. Certainly this most recent manifestation, and I think the new threat posed in terms of how Russia has used this as a tool, that introduces even another element of threat. But cyber attacks are occurring from many nations.
So no matter where they come from, if they come from Belgium, if they come from France, if someone is conducting cyber attacks against the United States and we pass a law that authorizes the President to sanction them or actually imposes these sanctions as mandatory, would you advise the President sign it?
I think it is that second element, Senator, that you just described that leaves the executive branch no latitudes or flexibility in dealing with the broad array of cyber threats. I think it is important that those be dealt with on a country-by-country basis, taking all other elements into consideration in the relationship. So giving the executive the tool is one thing. Requiring the executive to use it without any other considerations, I would have concerns about.
So, Mr. Tillerson, I understand your testimony. You're saying it was mandatory. You would not be able to advise the President to sign it because you want to have the President have the flexibility to decide which countries to sanction and which ones to not sanction.
Under which circumstances to sanction?
In essence, because you want to be able, for example, to take other things into account, like, for example, the desire to perhaps improve relations with that country, and therefore the President maybe doesn't want to sanction them, even though they're attacking us.
There could be a whole array of important issues that require consideration, including trading issues, trade relation issues, mutual agreements around our national security. So I don't think it's appropriate, and certainly for me at this time, to indicate that I would just say that it's a blanket application. I think that is the role of the executive branch. It is the role of the Secretary of State and the State Department to assist and inform the President in judgments about how to use what is a clearly powerful tool.
Well, again, I mean, what's troubling about your answer is the implication that somehow, if there is some country that we're trying to improve relations with or have significant economic ties with, the president, you may advise the president not to impose sanctions on that country, on individuals in that country, out of concern that it could damage the rest of our relationship with them on a cyber attack, which is a direct attack on our national security and our electoral process. So let me ask you, would you advise the president-elect to repeal the Obama administration's recent executive orders regarding cybersecurity and Russian interference in the 2016 elections?
I think the president-elect has indicated, and if confirmed, I would support that what's really required is a comprehensive assessment of our cyber threat and cybersecurity policies. In my view, based on what I've been able to read and have been briefed, we do not have a cybersecurity policy. We do not have a comprehensive strategy around how to deal with what has been a rapidly emerging threat.
But,
and as I said, we're seeing it manifest itself in ways that we never envisioned.
But, Mr. Tillerson, I understand the cybersecurity plan. We have to have one to protect ourselves and handle cyber attacks against our country. That is separate from the question of whether people that have already conducted attacks should be sanctioned and singled out. There's an executive order that is now active that has sanctioned those individuals, and my question is, do you believe that executive order should be repealed by the incoming president?
If confirmed, Senator, I would want to examine it and all aspects of it in consultation, not only with the president, but with other interagencies that are going to have input on this as to their views.
Well, again, Mr. Tillerson, if all the executive order says is that certain individuals responsible for cyber actions against the United States will be sanctioned, and you still need to examine whether that's a good idea or not. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Let me ask you this question. Is Vladimir Putin a war criminal?
I would not use that term.
Well, let me describe the situation in Aleppo, and perhaps that will help you reach that conclusion. In Aleppo, Mr. Putin has directed his military to conduct a devastating campaign. He's targeted schools, markets, not just assisted the Syrians in doing it. His military has targeted schools and markets and other civilian infrastructure. It's resulted in the death of thousands of civilians. This is not the first time Mr. Putin is involved in campaigns of this kind. Back when he was just appointed prime minister before he was elected, and I'm sure you're aware of that period of time, there was a series of bombings, and they blamed it on the Chechens. And Mr. Putin personally said that he would punish them, and so he ordered the Air Force to bomb the Chechen capital of Grozny. They used Scud missiles to hit hospitals, the city's main outdoor market, packed with shoppers. 137 people died instantly. They used thermobaric and fuel-air explosive bombs. These are the bombs that ignite, and they burn the air breathed in by people who are hiding in basements. They used cluster munitions. He used battlefield weapons against civilians. And when it was all said and done, an estimated 300,000 civilians were killed, and the city was completely destroyed. By the way, there's credible body of reporting, open source and other, that this was all those bombings were part of a black flag operation on the part of the FSB. And if you want to know the motivation, here's what it is. Putin's approval ratings before the attacks against the Chechens was at 31%. By mid-August of that year, it was at 78% in just 3 months. So based on all this information and what's publicly in the record about what's happened in Aleppo and the Russian military, you are still not prepared to say that Vladimir Putin and his military have violated the rules of war and have conducted war crimes in Aleppo.
Now, those are very, very serious charges to make, and I would want to have much more information before reaching a conclusion. I understand there is a body of record in the public domain. I'm sure there's a body of record in the classified domain. And I think in order to deal with a serious question like this,
Mr. Tillerson, what's happened in Aleppo is in the public domain. The videos and the pictures are there.
Fully informed before advising the president.
Well, I encourage you. There is so much information out there about what's happened in Aleppo, leaving the Chechen issue aside. What happened there is clearly documented as well. There's so much information out there. It should not be hard to say that Vladimir Putin's military has conducted war crimes in Aleppo, because it is never acceptable, you would agree, for a military to specifically target civilians, which is what's happened there through the Russian military. And, I find it discouraging, your inability to cite that, which I think is globally accepted. I want to, in my last minute and a half here, move really quickly to an additional question. In fact, I want to enter two things into the record, Mr. Chairman, without objection.
Without objection.
The first is a partial list of political dissidents, journalists, and critics of Vladimir Putin who were suspiciously murdered or died under highly suspicious circumstances. The second thing I want to enter into the record is a letter addressed to this committee by Vladimir Morza, who himself was mysteriously poisoned and is an opponent of the Putin regime. I'd like to enter that into the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Tillerson, do you believe that Vladimir Putin and his cronies are responsible for ordering the murder of countless dissidents, journalists, and political opponents?
I do not have sufficient information to make that claim.
Are you aware that people who oppose Vladimir Putin wind up dead all over the world, poisoned, shot in the back of the head? And do you think that was coincidental, or do you think that it is quite possible, or likely, as I believe, that they were part of an effort to murder his political opponents?
Well, people who speak up for freedom in regimes that are repressive are often at threat, and these things happen to them. In terms of assigning specific responsibilities, I would have to have more information. As I indicated, I feel it's important that in advising the President, if confirmed, that I deal with facts, that I deal with sufficient information, which means having access to all information, and I'm sure there's a large body of information that I've never seen that's in the classified realm. I look forward, if confirmed, to becoming fully informed, but I am not willing to make conclusions on what is only publicly available or have been publicly reported.
None of this is classified, Mr. Tillerson. These people are dead. Political opponents are dead.
Your question was people who were directly responsible for that. I'm not disputing these people are dead.
Senator Menendez.
Thank you. Mr. Tillerson, congratulations on your nomination. Thank you for coming by to meet with me. And I'd like to take this opportunity to expand upon the conversation we had last week. Since you've worked in one sector for one company throughout your entire career, getting a sense of your worldview is incredibly important, since you will be the chief advocate and advisor to the President-elect on those issues. So I'd like to go through a series of questions. I think many of them can be answered by a simple yes or no. Others will probably take a greater, more extensive answer. So, and you've alluded to some of this in your opening statement. So let me go through several of them. Do you believe it is in the national interest of the United States to continue to support international laws and norms that were established after World War II?
Yes, sir.
Do you believe that the international order includes respecting the territorial integrity of sovereign countries and the inviolability of their borders?
Yes, sir.
Did Russia violate this international order when it forcefully annexed Crimea and invaded Ukraine?
Yes, it did.
Did Russia's continuing occupation of foreign countries violate international laws and norms?
I'm not sure which specific countries you're referring to.
Well, the annexation of Crimea, the
Yes, sir.
eastern Ukraine, Georgia, just to mention a few.
Yes, sir.
Does Russia and Syria's targeted bombing campaign in Aleppo, on hospitals, for example, violate this international order?
Yes, that is not acceptable behavior.
Do you believe these actions constitute war crimes?
Again, Senator, I don't have sufficient information to make that type of a serious conclusion. Coming to that conclusion is going to require me to have additional
Do you understand what
the
standard is for a war
I
crime?
do.
And knowing that standard and knowing what is all within the realm of public information, you cannot say whether those actions constitute a war crime or not.
I would not want to rely solely upon what has been reported in the public realm. I would want confirmation from agencies who would be able to present me with indisputable facts.
For all the
Senator
answers,
Menendez, if I could, let me ask a little bit.
if you won't take my time, Mr.
No, I'm not taking your time. It'll be added back. If you had sufficient evidence, though, in looking at classified information that had taken place, would that not be a war crime?
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
For all of these answers that you've given me, does the President-elect agree with you?
The President-elect and I have not had the opportunity to discuss this specific issue or the specific area.
Well, in your statement on page 3, you say, in his campaign, President-elect Trump proposed a bold new commitment to advancing American interests in our foreign policy. I hope to explain what this approach means and how it implement that policy if I am confirmed as Secretary of State. So I assume to some degree that you've had some discussion about what it is that worldview is going to be in order to understand whether you're willing to execute that on behalf of the person you're going to work for.
in a broad construct and in terms of the principles that are going to guide that, yes, sir.
And I would have thought that Russia would be at the very top of that, considering all the actions that are taking place. Is that did not happen?
That has not occurred yet, Senator.
It's pretty amazing. You built a career on ExxonMobil that you said afforded you the opportunity to engage regularly with world leaders, including Vladimir Putin in Russia. In 2013, he awarded you with the Order of Friendship Award. And in our conversations, you told me you had direct and personal access to the Russian president over the course of your tenure there. Then in 2014, ExxonMobil lobbied aggressively against sanctions on Russia after their invasion of Ukraine. Exxon lobbied against the Stability and Democracy for Ukraine Act, which I introduced in the Senate last year. You employed well-known Washington-based lobbyists to support these efforts. You personally visited the White House and reported that you were engaged, quote, at the highest levels of government. In essence, Exxon became the in-house lobbyist for Russia against these sanctions. Sanctions are one of the most effective diplomatic tools in our arsenal, one we rely on to avoid putting American lives at risk by engaging in traditional kinetic warfare. Now, today, in response to a previous question by Senator Cardin, you said sanctions are a powerful tool. But you have made statements and given speeches where you have said you do not believe sanctions are a useful tool. So if sanctions are not a useful tool, have you changed your view? What are the tools of peaceful diplomacy you will use to get countries to return and act within the international order? What are you going to say to Vladimir Putin when he says to you, but Rex, you said sanctions were bad?
Senator, I think it's important to acknowledge that when sanctions are imposed, they by their design are going to harm American business. That's the idea, is to disrupt America's business engagement in whatever country is being targeted for sanctions. And so broadly,
I don't think it's to disrupt American business. I think it's to disrupt the economies of those countries. Now, American business may or may not be affected to some degree.
American business, if America is going to have an influence on disrupting those economies, then the intent behind the sanctions is to disrupt that country's access to American business investment, money flows, technology, and all the
financial sectors.
Correct.
Our financial sector.
So by its very, and I'm only stating a fact, I'm not debating it, but the fact is sanctions, in order to be implemented, do impact American business interest. In protecting America's interest, and I think this is where the President-elect would see the argument as well, is sanctions are a powerful tool. Let's design them well, let's target them well, and then let's enforce them fully. And to the extent we can, if we can have other countries join us, or if we are designing sanctions in concert, let's ensure those sanctions apply equally everywhere. So
when you made your remarks, and I have a long list here, which I'll introduce for the record, you did not differentiate that way. You basically made the broad case that sanctions are not an effective tool. Now, I heard your response now, but in your opening statement, you said that, quote, America must continue to display a commitment to personal liberty, human dignity, principled action in our foreign policy, and that we are the only global superpower with the means and moral compass capable of shaping the world for good. I totally agree with you in that respect. But, Mr. Tillerson, our efforts in leading the international community, for example, on sanctions against our adversaries like Iran and North Korea, represent exactly that, leadership and a moral compass. It's not about disadvantaging American businesses. It's about putting patriotism over profit. Diplomacy is not the same as deal-making. Diplomacy requires getting other countries often to do things they may not always want to do, and there isn't necessarily something to trade for it for. This is how we were able to build an extensive and effective sanctions network against Iran. Through legislation from Congress and diplomatic pressure from secretaries of state across different administrations, we were able to build the framework of primary and secondary actions that ultimately crippled Iran's economy. Now, you lobbied against the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions Accountability and Divestment Act, which I was the author of. You reportedly, under ExxonMobil, and I say you, ExxonMobil, but you were the head of ExxonMobil, wanted to eliminate secondary sanctions that would prevent joint ventures. This makes sense, as in 2003, and 2004, and 2005, you were engaged to a subsidiary company in businesses with countries who the United States listed as state sponsors of terrorism, including Iran, Syria, and the Sudan. Countries that, except for the maneuver of your subsidiary, ExxonMobil could not have been dealing with. ExxonMobil is listed as a coalition member of USA Engage, an advocacy group that lobbies against sanctions. This group also lobbied against sanctions, including against Iran, and applauded passage of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. So my question is, with that as a history, with the work that you did in the spring of 2011, where you oversaw an ExxonMobil deal with the Kurdish regional government in Iraq, after the United States government expressly did not want to see that happen, fearing that a deal would undermine the U.S. policy of one Iraq and lead the country closer to civil war. What message are you now going to be able to send to American businesses who are intent on pursuing their own interests at the expense of U.S. policies and potential political stability in foreign countries? How are you going to recalibrate your priorities as Secretary of State? Your shareholders are the American people and their security and their interests.
Well, there was a lot in that question, Senator.
I'll give you the rest of my time.
Around which I could respond. First, I have never lobbied against sanctions, personally. I continue to believe
sanctions. The company you directed did.
To my knowledge, Exxon never directly lobbied against sanctions, not to my knowledge. In terms of all the other actions that were mentioned there, they were all undertaken with a great deal of transparency and openness and engagement and input to the process. That's the beauty of the American process, is that others are invited to express their view and inform the process. But my pivot now, if confirmed to be Secretary of State, will have one mission only, and that is to represent the interest of the American people. And as I've stated multiple times, sanctions are an important and powerful tool. But designing poor sanctions and having poor and ineffective sanctions can have a worse effect than having no sanctions at all if they convey a weak response. So it's important in designing sanctions that, as I've said, that they're carefully crafted, they're carefully targeted with an intended effect, and then enforced. And to the extent American leadership then can broaden participation in those sanctions, and you're exactly right, the Iran sanctions were extraordinarily effective because others joined in.
Thank you. Senator Menendez has played an incredible role for our nation, making sure that sanctions are in place, and has led us all, if you will, relative to Iran. As my first longer interjection, and let the records say your time ran over to accommodate the interjection I made earlier. It's my understanding, and I think you called me during this time, that your concern with the sanctions that were in place relative to Iran were not that they were put in place, but that the Europeans had put them in a way that was different, and it caused an adverse situation for U.S. business relative to European businesses. Is that correct?
That was with respect to the sanctions for Russia. That's correct.
Okay. With that, let me just, on Senator Rubio's questions, I understand how a nominee would wish to be careful how they answer, especially one that plans to do what they say. In the event with many of those where he was asking about war crimes, if you are able, through your own independent knowledge in working with classified agencies here within the government, to determine that the types of activities that he so well articulated took place, you would agree that those, in fact, would be war crimes?
Yes, sir.
Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, welcome, Mr. Tillerson. I imagine you're having a pretty good time already. I want to pick up a little bit on sanctions, because I've had my own legitimate concerns about the effectiveness of sanctions and the double-edged sword nature of them. For example, you are pretty well aware of events and public opinion inside Russia. I mean, I'm concerned that some not well-designed sanctions can actually solidify, for example, Vladimir Putin's standing within Russia. I mean, is that a legitimate concern on sanctions?
Yes, sir, I think it is.
In your testimony, a couple statements, you said that Russia is not unpredictable, which means, another way of saying that Russia is pretty predictable. Russia does not think like we do. Can you further expand on both those comments?
Well, in terms of their...
Why is Tillerson friends with Putin? Because they both want to drill and burn the Arctic. That will ruin the climate and destroy the future for our children and grandchildren. Please don't put Exxon in charge of the State Department. Protect our children and grandchildren. Please don't put Exxon in charge of the State Department.
Yeah, Bertie, if you would, I can easily add time myself, but if we'd stop the clock when these kind of interferences take place, it'd be appreciated. With that, Senator Johnson.
If you forgot the question, it was explain your comments that Russia is predictable, basically, and that Russia does not think like we do. Expand on that.
Well, in my experience of both dealing with Russia and representatives of Russian government and Russian entities, and then as the length of time I've spent in Russia as an observer, my experience with the Russians are that they're very calculating, they're very strategic in their thinking, and they develop a plan.
As expendable. In our home state of Texas, people are resisting dated pipelines. Whether or not you become Secretary of State, oil is dead and people will not stop. Senators, be brave. Stop this man. Protect the vulnerable. Senators, be brave. Reject this man to protect the vulnerable.
Apologize for that, Mr. Tillerson. Now I can maybe answer the question unimpeded.
I've found the Russians to be very strategic in their thinking, very tactical, and they generally have a very clear plan that they've laid before them. And so in terms of, when I make the statement they're not unpredictable, if one is able to step back and understand what their long-term motivation is, and you see that they're going to chart a course, then it's an understanding of how are they likely to carry that plan out, and where are all of the elements of that plan that are on the table. And in my view, the leadership of Russia has a plan. It is a geographic plan that is in front of them, and they are taking actions to implement that plan. They're judging responses, and then they're making the next step in the plan based upon the response. And in that regard, they are not unpredictable. If Russia does not receive an adequate response to an action, they will execute the next step of the plan.
So be a little more specific. Summarize that plan that you see that they have.
Well, Russia, more than anything, wants to reestablish its role in the global world order. They have a view that following the breakup of the Soviet Union, they were mistreated in some respects in the transition period. They believe they deserve a rightful role in the global world order because they are a nuclear power. And they're searching as to how to establish that. And for most of the past 20-plus years since the demise of the Soviet Union, they were not in a position to assert that. They have spent all of these years developing the capability to do that, and I think that's now what we are witnessing is an assertion on their part in order to force a conversation about what is Russia's role in the global world order. And so the steps being taken are simply to make that point, that Russia is here, Russia matters, and we're a force to be dealt with. And that is a fairly predictable course of action they're taking. I think the important conversation that we have to have with them is, does Russia want to now and forever be an adversary of the United States? Do you want this to get worse, or does Russia desire a different relationship? We're not likely to ever be friends. I think, as others have noted, our value systems are starkly different. We do not hold the same values. But I also know the Russian people because of having spent so many years in Russia. There is scope to define a different relationship that can bring down the temperature around the conflicts we have today. And I think as Secretary Gates alluded to and as Secretary Nunn alluded to, both in their opening remarks, dialogue is critical so that these things do not spin out of control. We need to move Russia from being an adversary always to a partner at times, and on other issues we're going to be adversaries. It's not unlike my comments I made on China. At times China is friendly and at times China is an adversary. But with Russia, engagement is necessary in order to define what is that relationship going to be, and then we will know how to chart our own plan of action to respond to that.
In my mind, if I take a look at the spectrum of America's relationship with different nations, you have friends and allies, you have friendly rivals, you have unfriendly adversaries, you have enemies. And right now you're basically putting Russia in the unfriendly adversary category.
Well, unfriendly to enemies. I think at this point they clearly are in the unfriendly adversary category. I hope they do not move to enemy, because that would imply even more direct conflict with one another.
But you don't hold out much hope that we can move them into the friendly rival category, maybe partners where we have mutual interest.
Yeah, Senator, I tend to think of that in three categories. There are our friends, there are our partners, and there are our adversaries. And at times, certainly our friends are partners from time to time on specific actions. Our adversaries from time to time can be partners, but on other issues, we're just not going to agree. And so we remain adversaries. An adversary at the ideological level is one thing. An adversary at the conflict level, direct conflict level, that's a very different.
I want to switch subjects a little bit. I agree with former Senator Nunn when he said that your business experience, your private sector background, your relationship with Putin is actually an asset coming to this position. I come from the private sector. I think that kind of perspective is sorely needed. I don't think we have enough people from private sector. I think economic strength is inextricably linked to national strength. Your background traveling the world, I know I asked you when we met, I don't know if you ever did the calculation. How many different countries have you traveled to?
I've never actually counted them up. I would say over 40, somewhere between 40 and 50. I've never actually counted them.
How many countries have you actually done deals with, where you've dealt with top leadership?
I've never counted those, but it's certainly probably in between 10 and 20 where I was directly engaged in a significant way.
Let me ask you, as somebody from the private sector, being asked to serve your nation, understanding you're going to be going through a process like this, understanding all the disclosure, leaving a life behind that I'm sure you valued. What was your greatest reservation saying yes?
Senator, when I went through all of the analysis, all the reasons I had for saying no, which is your question, were all selfish reasons. So I had no reason to say no.
You obviously had a responsibility as the CEO of ExxonMobil, fiduciary responsibility. Your role's going to change. Do you have any reservation? And can you just kind of describe exactly what your mindset is from making that transition?
Senator, I have no reservations about my clean break with my private sector life. It was a wonderful 41-and-a-half-year career. I'm extraordinarily proud of it. I learned an awful lot. But now I'm moving to a completely different responsibility. My love of country and my patriotism is going to dictate that I serve no one's interest but that of the American people in advancing our own national security.
As you've traveled the world with a business mindset, working at developing projects around the world, obviously you're hearing from people around the world. Former President Carter in June of 2015 was commenting on President Obama's foreign policy. And here's some excerpts of his quotes. He said he can't think of many nations in the world where we have a better relationship now than we did when he took over, President Obama. The United States' influence and prestige and respect in the world is probably lower now than it was 6 or 7 years ago. Is that your general sense as you've traveled around the world during the last 8 years of this administration, that our power, influence, prestige, respect is lower, that we have not developed better relationships around the world?
Well, Senator, I don't remember if I shared it with you in the meeting we had, but I know I shared it with others in meetings that in many respects I've spent the last 10 years on an unintended listening tour as I traveled about the world conducting affairs, engaging with the top leadership, heads of state in many of these countries. And I have had the opportunity to listen to them express their frustrations, their fears, their concerns as to the withdrawal and the stepping back of America's leadership, the lack of that engagement. And they are yearning and they want American leadership reasserted. When I met with the President-elect and we were meeting about his ultimately asking me to do this, I indicated to him, I said, Mr. President, we've got a tough hand of cards that you've been dealt. But I said, you know, there's no use in whining about it. There's no use in complaining or pointing fingers at anyone. We're just going to play that hand out because what I know is America still holds all the aces. We just need to draw them out of that deck. And that leaders around the world want our engagement. I said, you're going to be pushing on an open door because people want America to come back.
One of the reasons I really value the private sector experience is just in your opening statement, the number of times you used reality, clarity, moral leadership, moral clarity, moral lights, facts, use logic, clear priorities. Those are the words of a business person. That's why I think your perspective will be very welcome in the State Department. Thank you, Mr. Tillerson. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Tillerson, for being willing to consider the nomination which has been put forward to be Secretary of State. I agree with your opening statement that the United States has an important role to play in the world, not just standing up for our interests and values, but also for democracy, for press freedom, for human rights, for rule of law. You were unwilling to agree with Senator Rubio's characterization of Vladimir Putin as a war criminal. And you point out in your statement that Russia has disregarded American interests. I would suggest, as I think has been brought out in later testimony, that it not only has disregarded American interests, but international norms and humanitarian interests. The State Department has described Russia as having an authoritarian political system dominated by President Vladimir Putin. Meanwhile, Freedom House currently puts Russia in a category of countries like Iran with very restricted political rights, ruled by one part or military dictatorships, religious hierarchies, or autocrats. Do you agree with that characterization of Russia and Vladimir Putin?
I would have no reason to take exception.
Senator Rubio and Senator Cardin both talked about some of those people who have been victims of the Putin authoritarian regime in Russia. And behind me is a poster with a recent New York Times story. I quote, "More of Kremlin's opponents are ending up dead." I'd like to ask unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, to enter the article into the record.
Without exception. Objection.
I think a picture is always worth 1,000 words, and when you put a face to Sergei Magnitsky, as this poster does, and see two other victims of the authoritarian regime in Russia, I think it speaks to what's happening there and how we should think about the country and dealing with President Putin. So I understand what Senator Nunn said, and former Senator Nunn and Secretary Gates said when they talked about the need to have dialogue with Russia and to continue a mill-to-mill relationship. But I also think it's important for us to understand who we're dealing with. In 2008, you notably said that there's no respect for the rule of law in Russia today. Do you think that continues to be true?
That is still the case, yes.
So I think you can probably understand, Mr. Tillerson, why some of us are very concerned about the President-elect's statements praising Vladimir Putin's leadership, his intelligence, including after being reminded of his ruthless persecution of political enemies, and after receiving compelling information that Russia has interfered with our elections. So do you think now is the right time to lift sanctions against Russia?
I think it's important that we keep the status quo until we are able to develop what our approach is going to be. That it will be all part of the approach. That is part of the incentives on the one hand, or part of the greater pressure on the other that will be an important element of developing that approach of that first conversation with Russia. If confirmed, that is the foreign policy step that I will be working through other interagencies, again informed in the National Security Council with classified information, as well as being informed by the views of others to develop that strategic approach to engagement with Russia. So I would leave things in the status quo so that we are able to convey this can go either way.
Under your leadership, ExxonMobil has invested more than $100 million in its Global Women's Economic Opportunity Initiative, partnering with the U.S. government and foreign governments. As you know, the State Department also places a high priority on global women's empowerment, on gender equity, on combating violence against women. I was very disturbed when there was a request from the Trump transition team to find out who the employees within the State Department have been who have worked on gender equity programs, and while I know that has been walked back by that transition team, I still think it sends a chilling message to people in the State Department and to people concerned about efforts to empower women around the globe. So can I ask whether you agree that we should continue that initiative to empower women, and what steps you would take to ensure that the State Department and USAID continue to fund necessary programs to address global women's issues?
Well, Senator, this is an issue that's long been important to me personally as well. I have seen firsthand the impact of empowering women, particularly empowering women's participation in economic activities in the lesser developed part of the world. I know this is a really important area to you, and we talked about it in your office, and there is study after study to confirm that when you empower women in these developing parts of the world, you change the future of the country because you change the cycle within that family, whether that woman has daughters or sons. When you empower the woman and they see them participating at an economic level, it changes the way they will view things as they grow. I've seen specific examples and visited projects in Papua New Guinea, which allowed women to participate by forming a coalition of bread bakers. It takes very little money. Now, these are women that want the opportunity. What they need is the wherewithal and some structure to guide them around how to conduct a small business. Interesting in that example, when the women began to be successful selling their bread in villages all up and down the trails in the jungle, their next concern when they came to our folks was, we've got all this money and we're having to hide it all over the place and we're worried somebody's going to steal it. What do we do? They were introduced to banking. And they were assisted with opening a bank account in the capital of Port Moresby. This is just an example, though, of think about someone who starts with nothing, doesn't even know what a bank is, and all of a sudden now they have a bank account. So that will change their children, and it will change the cycle within that area. So these are extraordinarily powerful programs.
I certainly agree with that. And does that mean you will commit to continuing those programs if you're confirmed as Secretary of State? Yes, ma'am. I think it's an important part of all of our foreign aid assistance efforts, whether it's through USAID or whether it's through other opportunities we have in more structured ways. Thank you. Under your leadership in 2012, ExxonMobil's foundation also helped develop a roadmap for promoting women's economic empowerment that specifically cited access to family planning and reproductive health services as a means to improve productivity and earning potential for women. You and I also served, as we discussed in 2010, on the Center for Strategic and International Studies Commission on Smart Global Health Policy, which also advocated for expanded access to family planning services. Will you pledge to continue to prioritize quality family planning and reproductive health services for women worldwide and ensure that resources and access to these programs are not conflated with support for abortion?
Well, Senator, there are statutory requirements in place around the foreign aid. They're well known, I know, to yourself and myself as well. As I understand it, we currently invest a little bit or something around $500 million a year in programs directed at family planning through foreign assistance. And I think that's an important level of support.
So do I take that as a yes?
Well, I would want to, if confirmed, and I have the opportunity to examine all of the aspects of that program, I just am aware that we do spend about $500 million now.
Well, as you know, if the approximately 225 million women worldwide with unmet family planning needs had access to modern methods of contraception, we would see 52 million fewer unintended pregnancies, resulting in 600,000 fewer stillbirths, 6 million fewer miscarriages, and 15 million fewer unsafe abortions. So I would attest that this is not only a humanitarian value that we should support, but also an economic one. And I'm almost out of time, but I just want to go back to Russia for a brief moment, because as you talk about the potential to work with them, one of those areas that we've been successful on is the New START Treaty back in 2010, which this committee supported and the Senate supported, which ensures that Russians have to reduce their nuclear warheads and delivery vehicles. And it's given us more access to on-site inspections. Do you believe that continuing to support those efforts is important for us?
Yes, Senator. I think, again, this is an area where we have to stay engaged with Russia and hold them accountable to commitments made under the New START, and also ensure that we are in a position to meet our accountability as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Flake.
Thank you. Thank you for your testimony, and thank you for your willingness to serve. It is a difficult thing to put your family through and everything else, and so I want you to know how much we appreciate that. In your opening testimony, you talked about this war on ISIS, that it will take a while. That's the implication I get from what you wrote, and I think that's certainly true. In Congress here, we rarely declare war these days, but we do authorize the use of military force or pass a so-called AUMF. We've not passed one yet with regard to ISIS. We're still working under an ill-fitting 2001 AUMF with regard to al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Senator Kaine and I have offered a bipartisan AUMF to deal with al-Qaeda, or I'm sorry, with ISIS. And we think that it certainly helps to have congressional buy-in, that our allies certainly deserve to know where we are, and our adversaries need to know. What are your thoughts with regard to an AUMF, specifically regarding ISIS?
Well, I think the President-elect, in broad terms, indicated during his campaign and in comments made in other instances that he believes it is important that we not just lightly go into these conflicts, that he would seek the engagement of Congress and the support of Congress in some means, whether it's through a sense of the Congress or specific legislation. So I would not disagree with your characterization that it is much more powerful when the U.S. shows up with everyone aligned. And I think having the support of the Congress standing behind those decisions to commit U.S. men and women, U.S. military resources, does give us a much stronger position than to engage with allies in building those alliances that are important. And in the case of defeating ISIS, that is one of the first actions that is going to be necessary, is to re-engage with our allies in the area and ensure that we know what they are willing to commit as well. So yes, I would strongly support engaging, certainly at the minimum, with this committee, and ultimately, if legislative action would support our efforts to defeat ISIS, I would be certainly talking to the President about that.
Well, that would certainly be welcomed here. What we don't want to see, I don't want to speak for my colleagues, certainly, but what I would not like to see is what we saw after the promise and the drawing of the red line, which you mentioned in your testimony. When you draw a red line, you said we sent weak or mixed signals with red lines that turned into green lights. I think that's certainly the case, but what happened with the last administration is that red line was drawn, but rather than enforce that red line when it was crossed, the administration came to Congress to ask permission. And we always enjoy the administration coming to us, but when you draw a red line, enforce it. The War Powers Act allows 60 days. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think that kind of collaboration with Congress is using us as a crutch rather than an ally in this battle.
No, I take the point.
With regard to Cuba, you mentioned that their leaders, under the new arrangement we have with diplomatic relations and loosened travel restrictions, I believe you're referring to, their leaders receive much while their people have received little. This serves neither the interest of Cubans or Americans. I would encourage you in the coming weeks and months to look at what has happened in Cuba. Certainly, I think the government is no less repressive with regard to dissidents. That is still going on. But when President Obama allowed Cuban Americans in particular to travel unfettered to Cuba and lifted caps on remittances, it allowed Cubans who had previously worked for the government in Cuba to engage in private sector activity. And from virtually no private sector employment in Cuba, we've gone to about 25% of the Cuban workforce in the private sector. And I would submit that they enjoy now a measure of economic freedom and political freedom that they didn't before. So I think that has benefited the Cuban people and will continue to if we continue the approach that we've now taken. And so I do share your aversion to sanctions, particularly those that are not multilateral. And I think we've seen that in spades in Cuba over the years, where it was only the U.S. who employed sanctions and then sanctions that weren't comprehensive and didn't mean that much other than giving the regime there a convenient excuse for the failure of socialism. So I would encourage in the next couple of weeks to look at what's happened in Cuba with regard to our new policy. With regard to Africa, we had a good discussion in my office. You at ExxonMobil have dealt with Africa a lot. Let's talk about soft diplomacy for a while. We have a lot of programs through USAID all over the continent. As you've viewed those programs, in addition to what ExxonMobil has done in the corporate governance area, what works and what doesn't? How can we refashion some of our policies to nudge countries toward democracy that need nudging, or that punish countries where it deems fit, or encourage cooperation with us on security measures or humanitarian measures?
Well, certainly the use of important USAID assistance, it really falls in kind of two broad areas: disaster relief, addressing imminent situations on the ground, whether it's starvation or the result of storms or as a result of conflict, providing assistance to relieve the immediate suffering. That is an important part of USAID. Over the past few years, in looking at the balance of that against what I would call development assistance, which is designed to create change, which hopefully becomes a sustainable change, that regrettably, the disaster assistance part of that budget has grown, and that means there's less available for development. Other important ways in which we can provide assistance, though, are through other mechanisms, such as the Millennial Challenge Corporation. For those countries that qualify, that's a different model. And so I think in terms of what is the issue we're trying to address, that then conditions put obligations on the country then